I'm Aubrey, 28, and I thought I knew my family. Turns out I knew absolutely nothing. The silence at our Thanksgiving dinner table was so thick you could have used it as gravy. My fiancé Marcus sat beside me, his plate barely touched, while my parents exchanged meaningful glances across the turkey like they were coordinating some kind of military operation. They hadn't asked him a single direct question in 2 hours. Not one. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely blindsided by people you trusted. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me paint you the picture of how we got to this masterpiece of family dysfunction. I'd been dating Marcus for 8 months when I decided to bring him home for Thanksgiving. Revolutionary idea, right? I mean, what could possibly go wrong with introducing your boyfriend to your loving, supportive family? I'd brought boyfriends home before. Jeremy the lacrosse player, David the wannabe musician who couldn't tune a guitar to save his life. My parents had always been polite, if not warm. Mom would ask about their jobs. Dad would grunt appropriately about whatever sports team was convenient. Standard parent protocol for sizing up whether your daughter's boyfriend was worth keeping around. But the moment we walked through that familiar front door, something shifted. And by shifted, I mean it felt like we'd entered an alternate dimension where basic human decency had been temporarily suspended. Mom's smile was so forced it looked like someone was threatening her family off camera. Dad shook Marcus's hand like he was handling radioactive waste. Even my normally chatty sister Emma managed a barely audible hello before suddenly remembering she had extremely urgent teenage business to attend to upstairs. So Marcus, I tried during dinner, desperately filling the silence that was threatening to suffocate us all. Tell them about your work in urban development. Marcus straightened slightly, probably hoping this was his moment to prove he wasn't whatever they'd apparently decided he was. I'm working on affordable housing projects in downtown Portland. Community-focused development that prioritizes long-term residents and prevents displacement. Impressive, right? Wrong. My father's response was a grunt that could have meant anything from fascinating to, please pass the salt. My mother suddenly became deeply fascinated by rearranging the cranberry sauce on her plate like she was creating some kind of edible art installation. The rest of the weekend followed this delightful pattern. When Marcus offered to help with dishes because he's actually a decent human being, Mom waved him off like he'd suggested juggling the good china. When he tried to engage Dad about the Portland Trail Blazers, my father suddenly remembered urgent yard work that absolutely could not wait another minute. By Sunday morning, my stomach was twisted in knots watching the man I loved become increasingly quiet and withdrawn. It was like watching someone slowly disappear right in front of me. The drive back to Portland was mostly silent. Marcus stared out the passenger window at the passing farmland while I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing through every painful interaction. Finally, as we approached the city limits, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "They're not usually like that." Marcus turned to look at me, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. "Aubrey, we need to talk." Those 4 words hit me like ice water in the face, because deep down, in that place where you keep the truths you don't want to acknowledge, I already knew exactly what he was going to say. "Your parents don't like me because I'm black." The words hung in the air between us like a confession I definitely wasn't ready to hear. I pulled into our apartment complex parking lot and turned off the engine, but neither of us moved to get out. Apparently, we were having this conversation right here, right now. "That's not," I started, then stopped. Because honestly, what was I going to say? That my parents weren't racist? That there had to be some other perfectly reasonable explanation for why they'd treated my wonderful boyfriend like he was carrying the plague? The evidence was staring me right in the face, and I'd been too comfortable in my little bubble of family loyalty to see it. Sometimes the truth hits you like a brick to the face, and sometimes it just sits there waiting for you to stop being willfully blind. "Marcus, they're just protective," I said weakly, even as the words tasted like lies in my mouth. "They need time to warm up to people." He looked at me with something between disappointment and pity, which was honestly worse than if he'd just gotten angry. "Baby, I've seen this before. The polite distance, the way they talk around me instead of to me, how they suddenly become busy when I try to connect. This isn't about needing time." And then it hit me. Jeremy, tall, blonde, played lacrosse like it was his calling in life. My parents had practically adopted him within 5 minutes of meeting him. Dad had taken him fishing. Mom had shown him her precious garden and asked his opinion on potential renovations like he was some kind of landscaping guru. But Marcus, brilliant, kind, successful Marcus who remembered my coffee order and called my grandmother every Sunday just to check on her, was being treated like an unwelcome door-to-door salesman in his girlfriend's childhood home. "Maybe I should talk to my mom," I said, already dreading what would definitely be the most uncomfortable conversation of my adult life. Clear the air, you know? Marcus reached over and took my hand, and I realized his was steadier than mine. Aubrey, you don't have to fix this. You didn't create this situation, but we both need to acknowledge what's actually happening here. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every interaction from the weekend, but this time seeing them through Marcus's eyes instead of my own rose-colored glasses. The way my mother had redirected conversation whenever he spoke, how my father had literally turned his back when Marcus tried to discuss local politics, the complete and utter absence of curiosity about his life, his family, his goals. It was like they'd decided who he was before he'd even opened his mouth. The next morning, I called my mother while Marcus was at work, because apparently I enjoy torture. "Oh, honey," she said when I brought up the weekend's tension. Her tone was already defensive, which told me everything I needed to know. "We just want to make sure you're making good choices." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, though I was starting to suspect I really didn't want to know. A long pause that spoke volumes. "Well, you know how important compatibility is in a marriage, similar backgrounds, shared values, that sort of thing. Marcus and I have plenty of shared values. Mom, we both believe in community service. We're both close to our families. We both want kids someday. What more compatibility do you need? It's just different worlds, sweetheart. Sometimes love isn't enough. Different worlds." There it was, wrapped up in a nice little euphemism with a bow on top. I'd grown up hearing those phrases. Different backgrounds, cultural differences, their kind, without recognizing them as the polite racism they actually were. "I need to go," I said. "Aubrey, wait." But I hung up, my hands shaking with a combination of anger and heartbreak, because somewhere in my gut, I knew this was just the beginning of what was going to be a very long, very painful journey. 3 weeks later, I decided to try again, because apparently I'm the kind of person who touches the stove twice just to make sure it's really hot. Maybe the holidays had everyone stressed. Maybe seeing Marcus in a different setting would help. I invited my parents to dinner at our apartment, thinking neutral territory might work some kind of magic. They came, but honestly, they might as well have sent cardboard cutouts of themselves. It would have been more engaging. Mom spent most of the evening examining our books and photographs with the intensity of a detective gathering evidence for some kind of case. Dad sat on our couch like he was waiting for a root canal to begin. The enthusiasm in the room could have powered absolutely nothing. Marcus had made his grandmother's famous mac and cheese, the recipe he guards like it contains state secrets, and my parents picked at it like they suspected he might have laced it with arsenic. "This is interesting," my mother said, her tone suggesting it was about as interesting as watching paint dry in slow motion. After they left, citing an early morning as their excuse to escape by 8:30, because apparently turning into pumpkins was a real concern, I found myself standing in our kitchen surrounded by barely touched plates of what was honestly incredible food. Marcus was loading the dishwasher with mechanical precision, his jaw tight enough to crack walnuts. "Well, that was a disaster," I said, attempting humor to cut through the tension thick enough to require a chainsaw. "Actually, it was pretty illuminating," Marcus replied, his voice carefully controlled in that way that meant he was probably counting to 10 in his head. "Your mother asked me 3 times where I grew up, like she was trying to map out exactly which wrong side of town had produced me. Your father spent the entire evening checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be." The accuracy of his observations stung because I'd noticed the exact same things, but had chosen the comfortable path of ignoring them. My family's behavior was becoming impossible to defend, even with my gold medal level mental gymnastics. The next day, I drove to my parents' house alone. Time for honesty. Even if it killed me, which it very well might, I found my mother in her garden, deadheading roses with more aggression than the situation really called for. "We need to talk about Marcus." She sighed like I'd just told her we needed to discuss her least favorite topic in the universe. I wondered when this conversation would happen. "What exactly is your problem with him? And please don't give me vague answers about compatibility. I need specifics. Because I honestly can't think of a single legitimate complaint you could have about him." My mother sat heavily on her garden bench, suddenly looking every one of her 58 years. For a moment, I thought she might actually be honest with me. Silly me. "He's just not what we envisioned for you." Based on what? His education? His job? His character? Because Marcus has a master's degree, works in community development, and treats me better than any man ever has. So please, enlighten me about what's not to envision. Sometimes these relationships seem wonderful at first, but long-term, she trailed off, apparently unable to finish a sentence even she knew was indefensible. "Say it," I pressed, because I was apparently determined to make this as painful as possible for both of us. Whatever you're thinking, just say it. She looked at me with something between frustration and what might have been shame. I don't think he's suitable. Suitable. Such a careful, polite word to mask something so fundamentally ugly. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not just heartbreak, but the death of an illusion about the people who had raised me. Suitable for what, exactly? But she couldn't answer that question, could she? Because the honest answer would have required admitting something about herself that she wasn't ready to face. I've been thinking, Marcus said over dinner the following week. We were eating takeout from our favorite Thai place because neither of us had the energy to cook after another round of family drama. Maybe we should take a break from trying with your parents. I looked up from my pad thai. You mean give up? I mean stop setting ourselves on fire to keep other people warm. He set down his chopsticks and leaned back in his chair. Aubrey, I've watched you tie yourself in knots trying to bridge a gap they're determined to maintain. It's not fair to either of us. The thing is, he was right. Every interaction with my family felt like navigating a minefield while blindfolded and wearing clown shoes. I was exhausted from pretending things were normal when they clearly weren't. You think it's because you're black. It wasn't a question anymore. I'd moved past denial into acceptance, which was honestly a relief after weeks of mental gymnastics. I know it's because I'm black, Marcus said matter-of-factly, like he was stating something as obvious as the weather. I've lived with this my whole life, baby. I recognize the signs better than you do. The certainty in his tone made something twist in my stomach. Maybe if they just got to know you better? Aubrey. Marcus reached across the table and took my hands. Your parents have had multiple opportunities to get to know me. They've actively chosen not to. That's not about time or comfort zones. That's about a fundamental belief that I'm not good enough for their daughter because of something I can't change and wouldn't want to if I could. Hearing it stated so plainly felt like being slapped with a truth I'd been avoiding. But I couldn't argue with the evidence anymore, could I? So what do? We live our lives, he said simply. We make choices based on what's right for us, not what makes other people comfortable with their prejudices. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I'd been blind to before. Or rather, I stopped pretending not to notice them. The way my family's questions about Marcus always had an undertone of suspicion, like they were waiting for him to reveal some fatal flaw that would justify their attitude. How they never asked about his family, his childhood, his dreams. Like he wasn't worth knowing beyond the surface level they'd already decided was sufficient for judgment. The phone calls from home became less frequent. When my mother did call, she avoided mentioning Marcus entirely, like he'd ceased to exist in any meaningful way. My father started ending conversations whenever I brought up anything about my relationship. Even my sister Emma, who I'd always considered more open-minded than our parents, started making subtle comments about thinking long-term and considering all the challenges you might face. What challenges exactly? I asked during one particularly frustrating phone call. You know, cultural differences, family dynamics, the way other people might react. As if the problem wasn't my family's prejudice, but society's potential response to an interracial relationship. As if I should shape my entire life around other people's possible discomfort, instead of my own happiness. Emma, do you actually like Marcus as a person? A long pause that told me everything I needed to know. That's not really the point, is it? It's exactly the point. Do you think he's a good person? Do you think he treats me well? Do you think he makes me happy? It's more complicated than that, Aubrey. But here's the thing. It really wasn't complicated at all. It was actually very simple. My family had decided Marcus wasn't acceptable based on one unchangeable characteristic, and they'd wrapped that prejudice in a bow of concern for my well-being. That night, lying in bed next to the man I loved, I made a decision that would change everything. The call came 2 months before our wedding date. I was at work, reviewing contracts for a nonprofit housing project, when my phone buzzed with my mother's name. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won over self-preservation. We need to discuss your wedding plans, she said, without so much as a hello, because apparently we were skipping pleasantries now. Okay, I said carefully. What about them? Your father and I have been talking, and we think you're making a mistake. I set down my pen, my heart already starting to race like it was training for a marathon. What kind of mistake? This marriage, Aubrey. It's not going to work out the way you think it will. You're from different worlds, and those differences will cause problems you can't even imagine yet. Different worlds. There was that phrase again. Like a greatest hit she couldn't stop playing. That careful euphemism for what she really meant but would never say directly. Marcus and I are very happy together, Mom. We've talked through everything that actually matters. Finances, kids, career goals, where we want to live. We're on the same page about the things that count. Those aren't the only things that matter in a marriage, sweetheart. Then please, enlighten me. What else matters? Because from where I'm sitting, respect, love, shared values, and good communication seem pretty fundamental to a successful partnership. A long silence that stretched out like a piece of taffy. Then, like dropping a bomb, "We won't be attending the wedding." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I'd known our relationship was strained, but this felt like a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. "You're not coming to my wedding?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. "We can't support this decision. Your father and I think you're making an enormous mistake, and we won't pretend otherwise by celebrating it." I found myself laughing, though nothing about this situation was remotely funny. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're boycotting your only daughter's wedding because you disapprove of the man I'm marrying, not because he's abusive or dishonest or treats me badly, but because he's black. That's not—" "Yes, it is. It's exactly that, and we all know it. You know what, though? You're absolutely right about one thing. This is about different worlds. I live in a world where people are judged by their character, and you live in a world where skin color determines worth. Those are very different worlds indeed." I hung up before she could respond, because honestly, what was left to say? That evening I told Marcus about the conversation. He wasn't surprised, which somehow made the whole thing worse. "I'm sorry," he said, pulling me into his arms. "I know you hoped they'd come around eventually. I can't believe they're willing to miss their only daughter's wedding because of their prejudice." "Actually, I can believe it," Marcus said quietly. "Some people value their comfort zones more than their relationship. They're lost, though." 2 weeks later, we received their final answer in writing, a formal note declining their invitation, citing irreconcilable differences about our union. My father's signature looked like he'd signed a business contract rather than responding to his daughter's wedding. But something unexpected happened as our wedding day approached. Without the weight of my family's disapproval hanging over every decision, planning became joyful instead of stressful. Marcus's family embraced me completely, and our friends rallied around us with genuine enthusiasm and support. The day we said our vows under a canopy of white roses, surrounded by people who genuinely celebrated our love, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: pure, uncomplicated happiness. There was sadness, too. A family-shaped hole where my parents should have been. But there was also something I hadn't expected: freedom. I was no longer trying to win approval from people who had predetermined I wasn't worthy of it. Our honeymoon was the first time in months I completely forgot about family drama. 10 days in Costa Rica, hiking through cloud forests and learning to surf badly, with nothing but Marcus's laugh and the sound of ocean waves to interrupt my thoughts. It was like hitting a reset button I didn't know I needed. But real life was waiting when we returned to Portland, starting with the stack of wedding gifts that had accumulated during our absence. Most were expected: the usual collection of kitchen appliances and picture frames that mark the transition from dating to married life. The surprise came from Marcus's family. His grandmother had given us an envelope with a note in her elegant handwriting: "For your first home together." Inside was a check that made me do a literal double take at the number of zeros. "Marcus, this is serious money." He looked up from unpacking our suitcases, smiling at what must have been my shell-shocked expression. Grandma Rose doesn't do anything halfway. When she decides to support something, she goes all in. "But I mean, this is like down payment on a house money. Like, a really nice house money. Or," Marcus said, sitting beside me on our bed, "it's invest in our future money. Start something beautiful money." Grandma Rose always said the best gift you can give someone is opportunity. Over the following weeks, as we settled into married life, I started noticing things about Marcus's family that I'd somehow missed before. They were comfortable in a way that went beyond just getting by. Not flashy or ostentatious, but secure in a way that spoke of generations of smart decisions. His parents lived in a beautiful home in the hills, drove cars that purred instead of coughed, traveled frequently to places I'd only seen in magazines. His sister was finishing her PhD at Stanford without drowning in student loans like every other grad student I'd ever met. "Can I ask you something?" I said one evening as we walked through his parents' neighborhood. The houses were substantial. Not mansions exactly, but clearly expensive, with perfect landscaping and driveways longer than my parents' entire front yard. "Always," Marcus said, squeezing my hand. "How exactly do your parents afford all this? I mean, your dad's in logistics and your mom teaches high school. Those are good jobs, but this seems—" Marcus stopped walking and turned to face me. "I guess I haven't told you the whole story about my family." Something in his tone made my stomach flutter with anticipation. "What story?" "My great-grandfather started with one delivery truck in 1952. Built that into a regional shipping company by the time my grandfather took over in the 80s. Dad expanded it nationally, then internationally. It's not Amazon, but it's substantial." I blinked at him like he just told me he was secretly a superhero. "Substantial how?" Substantial enough that I don't technically need to work, though I choose to because I believe in what I do. Substantial enough that we could buy a house tomorrow if we wanted. Cash, travel for a year, start a foundation, pretty much whatever we decide we want to do. My head spun as I recalculated everything I thought I knew about our situation. The modest apartment we'd chosen, his practical Honda, his job in affordable housing, none of it had been about necessity. It had all been about choice. Why didn't you tell me before? Marcus began walking again, his hands in his pockets. Because I wanted you to know me, not my bank account. I've seen what money does to relationships when it becomes the focus. People start acting different, treating you different. I wanted you to fall in love with Marcus the person, not Marcus the trust fund. But I'm your wife now. Yes, you are. He stopped in front of a beautiful Tudor-style house with a for sale sign planted in the perfectly manicured lawn, which is why I thought you might want to see this place. It went on the market last week. That's when everything truly began to change. Not just our living situation or financial security, but my understanding of who I'd married and what our future could look like. And that's also when I realized my parents had rejected a man worth more than they'd ever see in their lifetimes, all because they'd never bothered to look past his skin color long enough to actually know him. Sometimes karma doesn't need your help. Sometimes it just sits back and lets people create their own consequences. The house Marcus showed me wasn't just a house. It was a statement written in marble and mahogany. I was still processing what he'd told me about his family's wealth when we pulled into the circular driveway of what would become our new home. "This is ours?" I asked, staring up at the sprawling Tudor mansion with its perfectly manicured gardens and three-car garage that was bigger than my childhood bedroom. "If you want it to be." Marcus squeezed my hand. "I know it's a lot to take in all at once." A lot was an understatement. The house was gorgeous in a way that belonged in architecture magazines. Not in my actual life. But here we were. That evening, as we walked through rooms that echoed with possibility, Marcus told me the real story of his family. His great-grandfather, Samuel Thompson, had started with nothing but determination and one battered delivery truck in 1952. Back then, being a black man trying to build a business meant doors slamming in his face on a daily basis. "Grandpa Samuel used to tell us stories," Marcus said, as we stood in what would become his home office. How he'd wait in company parking lots for hours just to get 5 minutes with a potential client. How some of them wouldn't even look at him directly, just pointed toward the service entrance like that's where he belonged. But Samuel was smart in ways that went beyond book learning. Instead of fighting a system designed to exclude him head-on, he found another way around it. He focused on reliability, speed, and service that was so exceptional it became impossible to ignore. One client became two became 5, and slowly, quietly, he built something that couldn't be dismissed or overlooked. My grandfather inherited a small regional company and turned it into a logistics network spanning the entire West Coast. My father took it international, built relationships in Asia and Europe. But here's the thing they all understood. Wealth is a tool, not an identity. What do you mean by that? Marcus gestured around the spacious room with its built-in bookshelves and massive windows overlooking our soon-to-be backyard. This house, the cars, the financial security, it's all kept private. We don't flash it around or use money to prove our worth because our worth was never about money to begin with. That's when I understood why Marcus had seemed so calm during those awful family dinners. He hadn't been intimidated by my parents' subtle condescension because he'd faced real prejudice before, the kind that came with actual consequences, not just hurt feelings. He'd watched his family overcome obstacles my parents couldn't even imagine, building an empire while people like them remained comfortable in their small-minded assumptions. So when my dad was checking his watch every 5 minutes and my mom was interrogating you about where you grew up, I was reading them, Marcus said simply. I knew exactly what was happening because I've seen it before. The polite distance, the way they tried to make me feel small. But baby, I stopped letting other people's limitations define me a long time ago. The irony was almost funny if you're into that kind of cosmic humor. My parents had rejected a man whose family probably had more money than everyone in our hometown combined. They'd been so busy judging him by his appearance that they'd never bothered to discover they were turning away exactly the kind of success they claimed to value. 3 months later, we moved into our new home. As I arranged books on built-in shelves and hung art on walls I'd only dreamed of owning, I realized something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was no longer the woman desperately seeking her family's approval. I was building something new, something entirely mine. And honestly, it felt incredible. Our first year of marriage was a revelation in ways I never could have expected. Not just because of the house or the financial security, but because I was discovering who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to prove myself worthy of love. Marcus had this way of making everything feel natural and unforced. the housekeeper who came twice a week, the landscaping service that maintained our gardens like something out of a home design show, the casual mentions of investment portfolios. None of it felt ostentatious because to him, it wasn't about showing off. It was just life. My grandmother always said money is like oxygen, he told me one morning over coffee on our terrace, which overlooked what I was still getting used to calling our pool. When you have enough, you don't think about it constantly. When you don't, it's all you can think about. I was finally learning to breathe again, and it was amazing. For our first anniversary, Marcus surprised me with something that took my breath away completely. I came home from work to find him standing in our driveway next to a gleaming silver Porsche 911, a huge red bow tied to the hood like something straight out of a luxury car commercial. "Marcus, what did you do?" "I got my wife an anniversary present," he said, grinning like a kid who'd just successfully hidden cookies before dinner. "Do you like it?" "Like it?" I circled the car slowly, running my hand along the perfect curves of the hood. I'd never owned anything this beautiful, this expensive, this completely unnecessary and wonderful. This probably cost more than I made in 2 years at my old job. "What is this?" "Like $250,000. "Something like that," Marcus said, clearly enjoying my reaction. "But here's the thing, it's not about the money. It's about celebrating what we've built together. That car wasn't just transportation, it was freedom. Freedom from worrying about reliability, from calculating gas money, from making do with whatever I could scrape together. It was beautiful and powerful and completely mine, and I wasn't going to apologize for enjoying it." Later that evening, as we sat on our patio with glasses of wine that probably cost more than my old monthly grocery budget, I pulled out my phone to capture the moment. The Porsche looked stunning in our driveway, the setting sun reflecting off its silver surface like liquid metal. "I have to post this," I said, already composing the caption in my head. "I mean, when will I ever have a first Porsche again?" Marcus laughed, that deep, genuine sound that never failed to make me smile. "Post away, Mrs. Thompson. You've earned the right to celebrate." The photo was perfect. The car, our beautiful home in the background, the golden hour lighting that made everything look like a luxury magazine spread. I added a simple caption, "Year 1, your blessed Tanj anniversary, new beginnings," and hit share. Within minutes, the likes and comments started rolling in. Friends from college, co-workers, neighbors, everyone celebrating our happiness and success. It felt good to share joy instead of constantly hiding struggle for once in my life. What I didn't expect was how quickly that simple post would travel beyond my immediate circle of friends. How a moment of pure happiness would find its way to people I'd been trying very hard to forget. Sometimes the universe has a sense of timing that's either perfect or terrible, depending on your perspective. The message came 3 days later, just as I was wrapping up a client presentation about sustainable housing development. My phone buzzed with a notification I recognized immediately, a text from my mother. My stomach dropped like I was on a broken elevator before I even opened it. "Where did you get enough money for a car like that?" Not congratulations or beautiful car or even, "How are you doing?" Just immediate suspicion wrapped in capital letters like she was shouting at me through the screen. Because obviously, in her narrow worldview, there had to be something fundamentally wrong with this picture. I stared at the message for a full minute, feeling that familiar cocktail of hurt and anger bubbling up in my chest like a science experiment gone wrong. Then came the follow-up text, because apparently one accusatory message wasn't enough. "I saw your Instagram post. That's a very expensive car. Aubrey, your father and I are concerned about how you're affording this lifestyle." Concerned, right. Because parents who refuse to attend their daughter's wedding are definitely motivated by genuine concern for her well-being. The logic was flawless. Marcus found me in our kitchen 20 minutes later, still holding my phone like it might spontaneously combust. "Everything okay?" My mother saw the Porsche photo. I showed him the messages, watching his expression shift from confusion to understanding to something that looked distinctly like protective anger. "Ah," he said simply, his voice carefully controlled. "And she assumes that we're either drowning in debt, involved in something illegal, or both." I laughed, but it came out brittle and sharp, because there's obviously no way her daughter could marry someone successful enough to afford nice things legitimately. Marcus was quiet for a moment, reading through the messages again with the kind of focus he usually reserved for work contracts. "What do you want to do?" And that's when it hit me like a lightning bolt of clarity. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't want to explain myself. I didn't want to defend my choices or prove my worth or convince anyone that my happiness was valid and justified. I wanted to tell the truth, all of it. The whole, unvarnished, spectacular truth. My fingers moved across the phone screen before I could second-guess myself. "You want to know where the money came from?" It came from the man you refused to get to know. The man you decided wasn't suitable for your daughter based solely on the color of his skin. The man whose family built a multi-million-dollar empire while you were busy worrying about what the neighbors might think. The man you were too prejudiced to see clearly. That's where the money came from, Mom. Any other questions? I hit send before I could lose my nerve, and it felt like jumping off a cliff in the most exhilarating way possible. The response came back within seconds. We need to talk. This has gone too far. But I was done talking. I was done explaining. I was done apologizing for living a life that exceeded their pathetically narrow expectations. Too far? I typed back, my fingers flying across the screen. What's gone too far? Your racism or my happiness? Because from where I'm sitting, only one of those things is actually a problem. This time, instead of a text, my phone started ringing. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. Finally, I just turned the damn thing off completely. Feel better? Marcus asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I leaned against our kitchen counter. Actually, yeah, I said. And surprisingly, I really did. I feel like I just stopped carrying something heavy that I didn't even realize I'd been holding this whole time. Sometimes the truth really does set you free, even when it burns a few bridges in the process. The voicemail started accumulating while my phone was off, like digital tumbleweeds of family drama. When I finally turned it back on the next morning, there were 7 messages waiting for me. The first few were my mother's voice, increasingly frantic, demanding I call her back immediately because we needed to sort this mess out. Then came my father's voice, gruff and uncomfortable, saying we needed to fix this situation like it was a plumbing problem instead of decades of prejudice finally coming to light. The last message was different, though. Different. My mother's voice, but smaller somehow. Defeated. Aubrey, honey, please call us back. We need to talk. Your father and I, we think maybe we made some mistakes. Please, just call us back. Marcus was making coffee when I played the message on speaker, because apparently I enjoy sharing my family dysfunction with the person I love most in the world. That sounded almost like an apology, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't holding his breath. Almost, I agreed, but not quite there yet. An hour later, they called together. I could practically hear the tension crackling through the phone as my father cleared his throat before speaking. Aubrey, we've been talking all night, your mother and I, about what you said about Marcus's family background. You mean about their money? I asked because I wasn't going to make this easy for them. About everything. My mother's voice was thick, like she'd been crying. We looked him up online. His family's company, their history, their business accomplishments. We had no idea. And there it was. Crystal clear. Not an apology for their racism, but shock at their massive miscalculation. They weren't sorry for judging Marcus by his skin color. They were horrified they'd been wrong about his bank account. So let me understand this correctly, I said, my voice dangerously calm. You're upset that you missed out on connections to a wealthy family? No. My mother's voice cracked like thin ice. That's not. We're upset because we hurt you, because we lost you, because we let our assumptions cloud our judgment. Assumptions. Still dancing around the actual words prejudice or racism like they were profanity. What assumptions exactly? I pressed, because I was apparently determined to make them say it out loud. A long silence that stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Then my father's voice, quieter than I'd ever heard it. We assumed he couldn't provide for you the way you deserved. We thought you were making a choice based on emotion instead of practical considerations. And you based that assumption on what exactly? Another silence, longer this time. I think you know, my mother whispered. And finally, we were approaching something resembling honesty. We were wrong, my father continued, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame. About Marcus, about his character, about what kind of man he is. We were wrong about a lot of things. We want to make it right, my mother added quickly, desperately. If you'll let us. If Marcus will let us. We want to apologize properly to both of you. I looked at Marcus, who had been listening to this entire conversation with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was hurt there, but also something else. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe just exhaustion. Aubrey, my mother's voice was pleading now, raw in a way I'd never heard before. We know we don't deserve it, but could we come visit? Could we meet Marcus properly this time? Could we try to fix this? Part of me, a larger part than I wanted to admit, wanted to say no. To let them live with the consequences of their choices. To make them understand what it felt like to be excluded and dismissed. But another part of me, the part that still remembered being 6 years old and thinking my parents were the smartest, kindest people in the entire world, wanted to give them one last chance. I'll talk to Marcus, I said finally. And I'll let you know. After I hung up, Marcus and I sat in our beautiful kitchen, surrounded by all the evidence of our success, and considered whether forgiveness was actually possible. What do you think? I asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I think they're about to get the education of their lives. I gave them our address with a mixture of anticipation and dread swirling in my stomach like competing weather systems. Part of me wanted them to see exactly what they'd dismissed so casually. Another part of me worried that seeing our lifestyle would make them think they'd been right to be concerned about money all along, just wrong about which direction it was flowing. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon in their 10-year-old Honda, which looked almost comically out of place in our circular driveway next to my gleaming Porsche and Marcus's BMW. I watched from our living room window as they sat in their car for a full minute, apparently gathering courage to approach the house like they were about to storm a fortress. When the doorbell finally rang, I took a deep breath and opened the door to find my parents looking smaller than I remembered. My mother clutched her purse like a life preserver, and my father's eyes were already scanning the house behind me with an expression somewhere between awe and recalculation. "Hi," I said simply, because apparently all my carefully rehearsed speeches had evaporated. "Oh, Aubrey." My mother's voice was thick with emotion. "Look at this place. It's beautiful." Marcus appeared beside me, offering them that calm, confident smile I'd fallen in love with, the one that never wavered, even in uncomfortable situations. "Mr. and Mrs. Davis, please come in. Welcome to our home." The next hour was perhaps the most awkward 60 minutes of my entire existence. My parents perched on our custom sofa like they were afraid of leaving fingerprints, their eyes constantly roaming around our living space like tourists in a museum they couldn't afford to visit. The art on the walls. Original pieces, not prints from Target. The fresh flowers that our housekeeping service arranged weekly in crystal vases I'd never thought to count the cost of. The view of our pool and gardens through floor-to-ceiling windows that let in light like it was liquid gold. Everything spoke of a lifestyle they'd never imagined their daughter accessing, let alone deserving. "This is quite a home," my father said finally, his voice careful and measured like he was commenting on the weather. "Thank you," Marcus replied easily. "Aubrey's made it beautiful. She has an eye for design I never knew I was missing." My mother was staring at a framed photo on our mantel, Marcus and me at his cousin's wedding the year before, surrounded by his extended family. Everyone dressed elegantly, everyone clearly prosperous, everyone black. "That's your family?" she asked, her voice smaller than usual. "Some of them," Marcus nodded. 3 generations of people who figured out how to build something lasting despite every obstacle thrown in their way. The unspoken contrast hung in the air like morning fog. While my parents had been comfortable in their middle-class bubble, making assumptions about people they'd never bothered to know, Marcus's family had been building an empire that spanned continents. When Marcus excused himself to take a work call, probably the most polite exit strategy in history, my parents and I were alone for the first time since their arrival. "Aubrey," my mother began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We had no idea. No idea about what exactly? About any of this. About who he really is, about his family's success, about what you've built together." I felt that familiar spike of anger rising in my chest. "You could have known all of this. You chose not to know. You decided who Marcus was based on what he looked like, and you never gave him a chance to show you anything else." My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We realize that now. We realize we made some very serious errors in judgment." "Errors in judgment," I repeated his words slowly, tasting their inadequacy. "Is that what we're calling racism now?" The word hung between us like a slap, and my mother actually flinched. "We're not racist people," she said quickly, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. "Really? Then explain to me why you decided Marcus wasn't suitable before you knew anything about his education, his career, his character, or his family background. Explain why the only thing that mattered to you was his skin color." They couldn't, of course, because there was no explanation beyond the truth they still weren't quite ready to acknowledge completely. When Marcus returned from his call, he found us all sitting in uncomfortable silence that could have been bottled and sold as awkwardness concentrate. "Everything okay in here? We were just discussing the importance of getting to know people before judging them," I said, my voice deliberately light. "About how assumptions can be expensive in more ways than one." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather used to say that prejudice is the most expensive luxury there is. Not just morally, but practically. You miss out on connections, opportunities, relationships, all because you decided you already knew everything you needed to know." As my parents prepared to leave, they stood in our foyer looking lost and diminished. The house around them represented everything they'd forfeited through their small-mindedness. Not just wealth, but access to their daughter's life, to future grandchildren, to a family they'd rejected before they'd even met them. "We're sorry," my mother said finally, the word sounding hollow in our marble entryway. "We're so sorry for everything." But sorry wasn't enough anymore. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the wedding they'd missed, the relationship they'd damaged, the pain they'd caused. Sorry was just the beginning of what it was going to take to fix this. After they left, Marcus and I sat on our patio watching the sunset paint our pool in shades of gold and amber. The silence between us was comfortable now. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has finally passed and the air feels clean again. "How do you feel?" he asked, his fingers intertwined with mine. "Satisfied," I said, surprising myself with how honest that answer was. Not vindicated exactly, but satisfied. Because they finally saw what they lost? Because they saw what they chose to lose, I corrected. There's a difference between an accident and a decision, and they made a decision based on prejudice. Now they get to live with the consequences. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Thank you for letting us visit. We understand now how wrong we were about everything. We hope someday you can forgive us." I showed the message to Marcus. "Think they really understand?" "They understand they miscalculated spectacularly," he said thoughtfully. "Whether they understand the deeper problem, that's going to take more than one afternoon of shock and awe." Over the following weeks, my parents tried to rebuild bridges they'd burned down to the foundation. Flowers arrived at our house with apology notes attached. My mother called regularly, asking about my work, my life, even tentatively inquiring about Marcus's family like she was trying to study for a test she'd already failed. My father, never comfortable with emotional conversations, sent awkward texts about sports and weather patterns, like maybe if we talked about safe topics long enough, we could pretend the elephant wasn't still sitting in the room. But something fundamental had changed between us, and we all knew it. The power dynamic had shifted completely and permanently. I no longer needed their approval or acceptance to feel worthy. I no longer measured my success by their opinion of my choices. Their approval had become irrelevant to my happiness. And honestly, that was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. When they invited us for Christmas dinner, their first acknowledgement of Marcus as an actual member of the family rather than an unfortunate temporary situation, I accepted, but on my terms. We would come for dessert only. We would leave immediately if anyone made Marcus uncomfortable in any way. And they would refer to him as their son-in-law, not Aubrey's husband, or any other diminishing phrase. That Christmas evening, watching Marcus help my father set up the new smart TV I'd bought them. Because honestly, their ancient television was embarrassing. I realized my revenge had been perfect precisely because it hadn't been revenge at all. I hadn't set out to punish them or prove them wrong. I'd simply lived my life authentically, building something beautiful with the man I loved despite their objections. Their punishment was entirely self-inflicted. They'd excluded themselves from happiness through their own prejudice and narrow-mindedness. They'd missed their daughter's wedding, lost months of relationship building, and forfeited their front-row seats to watching me flourish. But the real victory wasn't their regret, or their belated recognition of Marcus's worth. The real victory was my freedom. Freedom from the exhausting work of trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. Freedom from shrinking myself to fit into their limited worldview. Freedom from needing anyone's permission to be happy. As we drove home that evening in my beautiful silver Porsche, Christmas lights twinkling in every window we passed like tiny celebrations, Marcus reached over and took my hand. "Proud of you," he said simply. "For what?" "For building exactly the life you wanted, despite everything and everyone trying to convince you to settle for less." 3 years later, as I'm putting the finishing touches on this story, my parents and I have rebuilt a relationship based on mutual respect rather than their approval. They adore Marcus now, genuinely adore him, not just his bank account or family connections. They've learned to see him as I always have, brilliant, kind, funny, and absolutely worthy of love. But more importantly, I learned something about myself that I'll carry forever. I learned that the only approval I ever really needed was my own. I learned that love without conditions isn't actually love at all. It's manipulation with better marketing. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, loving freely, and refusing to let other people's limitations become your own. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button for more real stories about family drama, personal growth, and the sweet satisfaction that comes from proving people wrong just by being happy. Drop a comment below about a time when you had to choose between your own happiness and someone else's expectations. I read every single one, and your stories inspire me more than you know. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are against the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally. But here's what I learned. Winning doesn't mean destroying them. It means building something so beautiful they can't help but see what they almost lost forever.